Not all kindness is rewarded with kindness. This is a lesson that the desert teaches without mercy. The midday sun was burning mercilessly over the arid lands of Arizona when Jack Morrison spotted the two figures staggering on the dusty road. His worn-out boots treaded firmly on the parched ground as he drove his wagon laden with supplies back to the ranch. The hot wind whipped his weather-tanned face, but it was something different that made his eyes narrow under the brim of his hat. Two indigenous women, tall as the pines of the distant mountains, stumbled along the trail with uncertain steps. Jack's first impression was one of distrust. 40 years of living in those wild lands had taught them that every encounter could be their last. But when the wind changed direction, he picked up something that made his heart tighten. Blood. A lot of blood. The two women weren't just tired. They were injured, seriously injured. He pulled the reins, bringing the horses to a halt with a low neigh. The dust settled slowly around the wagon as Jack studied the scene before him. The Apache sisters were truly impressive. Even wounded and exhausted, her imposing height and haughty bearing did not go unnoticed. The eldest, perhaps 25, held the bloody arm of the youngest, who looked to be 18 or 19. Both wore traditional clothes, torn and stained with dried blood. The eldest's black eyes met his across the distance. There was no pleading here, just an iron dignity that Jack recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who prefers to die standing up than to live on his knees. She said something in Apache to her younger sister, who shook her head frantically, clearly trying to dissuade her from making a decision. Jack got out of the wagon with slow, deliberate movements. His hands remained visible, away from the revolver that rested on his hip. The wind whispered through the dry bushes, carrying with it the smell of blood and despair. He took one step forward, then another, until he was about 10 steps away from the two women. The eldest then spoke, in broken but clear English. "We don't need your help, white man." His voice was hoarse but firm as rock. Apache pride ran through his veins like fire, even in the face of imminent death. Jack took off his hat, running his fingers through his gray hair. The gesture was more than courtesy. It was recognition. "They may not have to," he said, his deep voice cutting through the hot air, "but I need to offer." The answer made the younger woman look up, surprised. It was rare to find whites who spoke with respect to the Apaches. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm that precedes a desert storm. Jack knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Helping wounded Indians could mean problems with neighbors, with the law, with everyone. But there was something about the dignity of these two women that struck a chord deep in his weary soul. The sun continued its relentless journey through the cloudless sky as the three of them stared at each other on the dusty road. In the distance, a hawk shouted, as if announcing that the fate of everyone there was about to be decided. Jack Morrison didn't know it yet, but his next decision would change his life forever. The eldest of the sisters took a stumbling step forward. Blood dripped from a deep wound in his shoulder, dyeing the dry earth red. "My name is Ayana," she said, each word costing a visible effort. "This is Chenoa, my sister." The youngest nodded slightly, leaning heavily on her sister. Jack nodded respectfully. "Jack Morrison," he replied, "and you are both dying." There was no drama in the statement, just the naked truth that the desert teaches to recognize. Ayana smiled bitterly, a smile that spoke of pain, pride, and acceptance. "We know," she said simply. Jack didn't hesitate. Without saying a word, he walked over to his wagon and pulled out a canteen of water and pieces of clean cloth that he always carried. The desert had taught him that poorly cared for wounds kill faster than bullets. He approached the two sisters with careful movements, as if approaching injured animals. "Let me see that," he said, pointing to Ayana's bloodied shoulder. She instinctively retreated, but Chenoa muttered something in Apache that made her stop. Jack wet a piece of cloth and began to clean the wound with firm but gentle hands. It was a deep cut, probably made by a knife or spear. "Who did this to you?" Ayana gritted her teeth when Jack touched the wound. "Soldiers," she spat. "Soldiers who think all Apache women are prizes of war." His voice carried enough hatred to set the entire prairie ablaze. Chenoa had minor cuts on his arms and a nasty bruise on his head, but nothing that would have put his life in immediate jeopardy. Jack worked in silence, bandaging his wounds with the skill of someone who had seen many battles. His calloused hands moved with surprising delicacy. "Do you have a family? Somewhere to go?" he asked, as he tightened the last knot of the bandage. "Our tribe is 2 days' ride away from here," Chenoa replied for the first time, her voice softer than her sister's. "But we can't get there in this state. The soldiers are still looking for us." Jack looked at the horizon. The sun was already beginning its slow descent towards the distant mountains, painting the sky in orange tones. Traveling at night would be dangerous, but leaving 2 women injured on the road would be a death sentence. He made a decision that he knew could be costly. "My ranch is 3 miles from here," he said, putting away the medical supplies. "You can spend the night there, recover a little. Tomorrow I will take them to a safe point in the direction of their tribe." Ayana and Chenoa exchanged a look full of meaning. Jack could see the internal struggle in their eyes. Accepting help from a white man went against everything they had learned about survival. But the alternative was to die right there on the dusty road. "Why would you do that?" asked Ayana, her voice charged with suspicion. "What do you want in return?" Jack put the hat back on his head and looked directly into the Apache woman's eyes. "Nothing," he said simply. "Sometimes a man does what is right, just because it is right." The wind blew harder, kicking up small swirls of dust around the 3. In the distance, a coyote howled, its melancholy sound echoing through the vastness. Jack helped the 2 sisters get on the wagon, Chenoa needing more support due to her head injury. The journey to the ranch was made in tense silence. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, looking for signs of danger. He knew that soldiers looking for fugitives would not hesitate to search civilian property, and if they met 2 Apache women on their ranch, the questions would be difficult to answer. Jack Morrison's ranch was modest but well-maintained. A simple wooden house, a faded red barn, a corral with a few horses and cattle. It was the kind of place a man builds when he wants peace more than prosperity. He stopped the wagon near the house and helped the sisters down. "The barn is safer," he said, pointing to the larger structure. "If someone comes looking for you, it's better that they won't be seen." Jack led them there, preparing a corner with fresh hay and blankets, brought clean water, food, and more medical supplies. Ayana watched his every move carefully. "You've helped my people before," she said. It was not a question, but a statement. There was something about the way Jack treated them, without fear or contempt, that spoke of previous experience. Jack stopped what he was doing and turned to her. "My wife was a Cherokee," he said simply. "He died of smallpox 5 years ago. She always said that kindness has no skin color." The revelation changed something in the air. Chenoa smiled for the first time since Jack found them. Ayana nodded slowly, as if an important piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. "His wife was a wise woman," she said. Jack finished tidying up the makeshift space and headed for the barn door. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow morning we leave." He stopped at the door and turned around one last time. "And don't worry about anything tonight. I'll be on guard." What Jack Morrison didn't know was that at that very moment, an Apache scout was watching his ranch from the top of a distant hill, and that the news of 2 missing sisters had already reached the ears of very dangerous people. The night would be long, but the dawn would bring consequences that none of them could have imagined. Night fell over the ranch like a heavy cloak, laden with omens. Jack sat on the porch of his house, the Winchester rifle resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the shadows that danced beyond the reach of the lamplight. The night wind brought with it sounds that only experienced men knew how to interpret. The nervous neighing of his horses in the corral, the sudden silence of the crickets, small signs that spoke of unwanted presence nearby. In the barn, Ayana and Chenoa rested on the hay, but sleep did not come easily. The older sister kept one eye open at all times, her right hand firmly grasping the small knife that Jack had allowed her to keep. Genoa had finally succumbed to fatigue, his regular breathing indicating the first true sleep in days. The wound on his head had stopped bleeding, and Jack's clean bandages were already showing signs of improvement. The dawn brought with it a fine mist that stretched across the plain like spectral fingers. Jack had only been dozing off for a few hours, always with an ear for any unusual sound. It was the behavior of his horses that completely awakened him. They were restless, moving nervously in the corral, their heads turned toward the hills to the north. Something was wrong. Jack stood up silently and walked to the barn. Ayana was already awake, her keen senses of an Apache warrior having picked up the same disturbance in the air that he felt. Their eyes met in the dim light of dawn, and a mutual understanding passed between them. Danger was approaching. The first visible sign came with the sunrise. A line of figures on horseback appeared on the northern horizon, dark silhouettes silhouetted against the reddish sky. Jack told quickly, 20, 40, 60. He kept counting as more knights appeared, 100, 150. His heart sank when he realized the true magnitude of what was approaching. Nearly 200 Apache warriors rode toward his ranch. Ayana watched the scene through a crack in the barn wall, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. He recognized some of the knights, even from a distance. They were from his tribe, led by his older brother, Cowboy, a warrior feared throughout the region. They had come looking for her and Chenoa, but the presence of so many men meant only one thing. They were prepared for war. Jack ran back to the house and grabbed extra ammunition for his rifle. He knew that resisting would be suicide, but handing over the two women was not in question either. His mind worked quickly, looking for alternatives in a situation that seemed to have no way out. The code of the West was clear about hospitality and protection of refugees. He had given his word, and a man in the West was worth only as much as his word. The Apache horsemen approached in military formation, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that partially obscured their vision. They stopped about 100 yards from the ranch, forming a semicircle that blocked any escape route. The silence that followed was more threatening than any battle cry. Jack could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on him, weighing his soul, measuring his intentions. Cowboy detached himself from the main group, riding slowly towards the barn. He was an imposing man, tall like his sisters, with scars that told stories of countless battles. Their traditional Apache clothing was adorned with eagle feathers and colorful beads that reflected their leadership position. He carried no visible weapons, but Jack knew that didn't mean he was unarmed. The Apache warrior dismounted a few feet from the barn and walked to the door. His movements were fluid like a feline's, each step calculated and deliberate. Jack emerged from the house with his rifle lowered but clearly visible. It was a gesture that showed preparedness without showing immediate hostility. The morning wind stirred up the dust between the two men. Behind Cowboy, the nearly 200 warriors stood motionless like statues, waiting for their leader's signal. Some had bows at the ready, others wielded spears and rifles. The tension in the air was so dense that it seemed almost solid. Inside the barn, Chenoa had awakened to the outside commotion. Ayana kept it low, whispering quickly in Apache about the situation. The younger sister understood the gravity of the moment. His brother had brought enough strength to raise a small town. The question now was whether Jack Morrison would live to see the sunset. The silent confrontation lasted an eternity that in reality was only a few minutes. Cowboy studied Jack with eyes that seemed to see through the white man's soul. The Apache warrior had the same imposing height as his sisters, but his bearing carried the weight of countless battles and the authority of one who commanded hundreds of men. Ritual scars decorated his bare chest, each telling a story of courage and survival. Jack remained firmly in his position, the rifle still lowered but ready. His years in the West had taught him to read body language, and he could tell that Cowboy had not come to immediate war. There was something else at stake here. The Apache warrior was evaluating, weighing options, deciding whether Jack Morrison was an enemy or something else. From the barn came an almost imperceptible sound. Ayana had made a decision. The wooden door opened slowly, and she emerged, walking with dignity despite her injuries. Chenoa followed her, leaning lightly on her older sister. The injuries were noticeably better after Jack's care, but they were still evident enough to tell his story. Kachada's face transformed at the sight of her sisters alive. The ruthless warrior mask unraveled for a moment, revealing the worried brother behind the legend. His eyes scanned over their wounds, the bandages cleaned, the obvious improvement in their condition. Then her gaze turned to Jack with a renewed but different intensity. It was no longer the assessment of an enemy, but the scrutiny of someone trying to understand an anomaly. Ayana walked until she stood between Jack and her brother. His posture was haughty, defiant, even in the face of 200 warriors. She began to speak in Apache, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who feared nothing and no one. Jack didn't understand the words, but he could grasp the emotional essence of what she was saying. He was defending him, explaining what had happened, telling him about his unexpected kindness. Chenoa joined the narrative, her voice softer but equally convincing. She pointed to her own bandages, to the medical supplies that were still visible, to the clean water and food that Jack had provided. The two younger brothers spoke quickly, their words overlapping in a cascade of explanations and defenses. Kachada listened in silence, her eyes alternating between the sisters and Jack. The other warriors remained motionless on their mounts, but Jack could sense a subtle change in the atmosphere. The deadly tension was turning into something more complex. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a debt of honor. The Apache warrior took a few steps toward Jack, stopping at a distance that would otherwise be considered intimate between strangers. His dark eyes studied every detail of the farmer's tanned face. Jack could feel the power contained in this man, the capacity for violence that slept just below the surface. But I also perceived something deeper: intelligence, justice, a code of honor as strict as his own. Kachada extended his right hand slowly, palm up. It was a universal gesture of peace, but also of recognition. Jack understood the significance, and after a moment's hesitation, he lowered his rifle completely and held out his own hand. The two men touched briefly, a momentary connection that sealed something important between opposing cultures. The Apache leader turned and made a broad gesture to his warriors, a sign that Jack could not interpret, but whose result was immediately visible. The arches were lowered. The booms were raised in an upright position. The battle formation relaxed slightly. It was not surrender, but clearly a reduction in the deadly tension that had dominated the last few minutes. Ayana watched the exchange between the two men with visible relief. He knew his brother well enough to know that he had made an important decision. Kachada was known for his justice as much as his ferocity. If he had decided that Jack Morrison was worthy of respect, then the situation had changed dramatically. The sun continued its ascent in the sky, casting smaller and smaller shadows on the dusty ground between the two groups. The moment of greatest danger had passed, but Jack knew they were still far from a complete resolution. 200 Apache warriors didn't ride hundreds of miles just to say thank you. There was something else Kachada wanted, some unresolved issue that needed to be addressed. The wind changed direction, bringing with it the smell of dust and horses, but also something further away: smoke. Jack frowned and looked at the southern horizon. A thin column of black smoke rose into the air, too far away to pose immediate danger, but close enough to be worrisome. Kachada had noticed it too, and his eyes narrowed dangerously. The smoke was not from a campfire or a domestic chimney. It was war smoke. The smoke on the horizon grew thicker with each passing minute, and Jack recognized the signs with a tight stomach. It was no ordinary fire. It was smoke from battle, from buildings being burned, from unbridled violence. Kachada also understood the meaning, and his expression hardened until it became a granite mask. The Apache leader made a quick gesture to one of his men, who immediately galloped off toward the smoke. Jack watched the scout disappear into the distance and felt a chill run down his spine. I knew that direction. The smoke came from the region where the city of Mesa Verde was located, a small village that served as a trading post for farmers and travelers. If the city was burning, it meant only one thing. The soldiers who had attacked the sisters were not alone. It was part of a larger military operation against the Apaches. Cachada turned to her sisters and spoke quickly in their native language. Jack didn't need to understand the words to understand the urgent tone. The warrior was explaining the situation, probably ordering them to leave immediately for safety. But Ayana nodded firmly, pointing to Jack and then to the distant smoke. He was arguing something, and Jack suspected he knew what. The argument between the brothers lasted only a few minutes, but it was intense. Chenoa joined the debate, her voice softer but equally determined. Jack remained where he was, respecting the family dynamic even without understanding the words. Finally, Cachada nodded reluctantly and approached Jack again. The Apache warrior pointed to the distant smoke and then to Jack, making gestures that clearly indicated a question about other settlers in the area. Jack understood immediately. Cachada wanted to know if there were more people like Jack nearby, people who might need warning about the approaching danger. Jack made a mental map of the area and pointed it in 3 different directions, indicating the neighboring ranches. The Sullivan family to the east, the Carter brothers to the north, and Elder Pete Johnson with his daughter Sarah to the west. They were all decent people who did not deserve to be caught off guard by a war that was not theirs. Cachada listened intently, memorizing the approximate directions and distances. The Apache leader then did something that completely surprised Jack. He turned to his warriors and gave a series of quick orders. Immediately, groups of horsemen broke away from the main group, setting off in the directions Jack had indicated. They did not go as invaders, but as messengers. Cachada had decided to warn the settlers of the approaching danger. The magnitude of the gesture did not go unnoticed by Jack. An Apache leader was using his own men to protect white farmers, simply because one of them had shown kindness to his sisters. It was an act of honor that transcended all racial and cultural barriers. Jack felt a lump in his throat as he watched the warriors set out on their missions of mercy. Ayana approached Jack as they watched the groups move away. Her eyes met his, and she placed her hand over her heart in a universal gesture of gratitude. Genoa did the same, smiling despite the injuries still visible. The 2 sisters had found something rare in the Wild West, a man who did what was right simply because it was right. Cachada returned his attention to Jack and pointed to the barn, making gestures that indicated an offer. Jack understood that he was being invited to accompany the Apaches to safety. It was a generous offer, considering that just hours earlier they were on the verge of a deadly confrontation. But Jack shook his head and pointed to his house, his ranch, his animals. This was his home, and he would not forsake it. The Apache warrior nodded with understanding and respect. Men from the West, whether white or Indian, understood the value of defending their own territory. Cachada held out his hand once more, and this time the grip was longer, more meaningful. It was a farewell between warriors who respected each other. The last Apache warriors prepared to leave, but not before leaving something behind. Cachada took a necklace of beads and feathers from his neck and placed it in Jack's hands. It was clearly an item of great personal and spiritual value. Jack realized that he was receiving not only a gift, but a symbol of protection and recognition. As the Apache knights disappeared over the horizon, leading the 2 sisters to the safety of their tribe, Jack remained standing in front of his barn. The Apache necklace weighed little in his hands, but it carried the weight of an unlikely friendship, forged in the midst of danger and sealed by mutual honor. Distant smoke still rose in the air, reminding us that the world remained a dangerous and unpredictable place. But Jack Morrison had learned something valuable in those 2 tense days. Sometimes, a simple act of kindness can change the fate of many people. And sometimes the difference between war and peace can be in the hands of an ordinary man who chooses to do what is right. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with golden and red hues. Jack carefully stored the Apache necklace in his home and went back to the daily work of taking care of his ranch. But she knew she would never forget the two giant sisters who changed her life, nor the warrior who chose honor over revenge. In the Wild West, stories like this were as rare as clean water in the desert, and equally precious. If you were moved by this story of honor and redemption in the Wild West, don't miss any of the upcoming adventures we have prepared for you. Here you'll find the most engaging narratives of cowboys, gunslingers, and pioneers who shaped wild America. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to be the first to follow each new story that will make your heart race like a racing horse.